The Harry Knight's domain was 300 miles west of the Bennet Knight's domain. In between them was another domain of an honorary lord. If there wasn't a need to go around this region, there was no way that Abel's trip would have taken as long as 6 hours. Despite being a royal who was granted his own land, the Knight of Bennet was in the middle high class, which was still a bit far from being an aristocrat. Besides, he wasn't quite good at socializing with the other nobles. He tried his best to keep a polite distance from the other upperclassmen. This made it quite difficult for him to request his own army to make a direct pass into another domain. The parade made its way to the Harry Knight's domain at around 3 in the afternoon. For over a distance, Abel could see a very big castle in front. On either side of this castle, red banners were depicting a rearing unicorn. Needless to say, they were the family symbol of the Knight of Marshall. From what Abel could see, his father clearly wasn't pleased to see this. The Bennet Castle had its own banner, but that was only 3 meters tall and 2 meters wide. It was something that the Knight of Bennet had inherited from his own father. While it was unfinished back then, he had to spend quite a bit of money to add the final touches to it. "It's a treasure for the next generation," he would always say. "He's doing this on purpose." The Knight of Bennet ground his teeth. "I've told him about the banners." Abel saw this, of course, and decided to slow down his horse for a bit. As upset as his father was, he didn't want to bring himself too close to any sort of trouble. At the front gate of the Harry Castle, a middle-aged man was wearing a full set of golden armor. He was accompanied by 2 of his bodyguards who, for the sake of rubbing it in just a bit more, were also fully equipped with some very fine leather gears. The Knight of Marshall had a carving of the God of Sun on his left chest and the crest of the white unicorn on his right. For someone of his age, he was much sturdier than most would expect. He was very tall, too. There were quite some wrinkles on his face, but instead of making him look old, it somehow gave off this mature and refreshing aura about him. Marshall, with a growl of a bloodthirsty tiger, the Knight of Bennet jumped down his horse and quickly walked towards the Knight of Marshall. The ground below him trembled every time he had taken another step. "Seth!" The Knight of Marshall responded with a roar that was just as loud and angry. With his golden hair flying in the air, he approached the Knight of Bennet with the menace of a fully maned lion. No one knew how to react to this. The two were meant to be best friends, but they looked like they were about to beat each other up. The two just kept on walking towards each other. They were so close to each other that the fists were perfectly in range for a knockdown punch. They didn't stop at that point either. Instead, when the chests were an inch apart, the two jumped at the same time and collided themselves right into each other. No fist, no kicks either, just 2 men pushing against each other with their armored chest. If Abel were to describe it, the noise that followed was almost to that of a car crash at full speed. What a strange but impressive exchange of raw strength. Both the Knight of Bennet and the Knight of Marshall had to take several steps back. The Knight of Bennet cursed as he steadied his 2 legs. "You became an intermediate knight. Why the hell didn't you mention that in the letter?" "Well, the same could be said for you," the Knight of Marshall replied as he caressed the bruise on his golden armor. "You didn't say you've become an intermediate knight." The Knight of Bennet, too, felt the urge to look at the dent on his own breastplate. After figuring out the cost that was needed for repair, he gave another shout towards the Knight of Marshall. "You play dirty, don't you?" "Yeah, I did become one. If I didn't, I would be on the ground right now." "Dirty? Look who's talking." The Knight of Marshall threw a dirty look at the Knight of Bennet. The Knight of the Bennet did the same, and the two just kept on staring at each other in silence. Just when everyone thought that there was going to be a fight, the two suddenly slapped each other's armor with their fist. Then they started laughing and hugging each other. Apparently none of that etiquette nonsense was important at this moment. The two brothers were glad to see each other, and that was all that mattered. As someone who held a secret so great he couldn't tell anyone about it, Abel could only hope to have a friendship this close. The adoption ceremony was very formal. They even invited a priest from the temple of the goddess of harvest. As the ceremony was being held, Abel received a suit directly from the Knight of Marshall. The suit was marked with the symbol of the unicorn coat of arms, which signified that Abel had been officially accepted into the family. The welcome banquet commenced after the adoption ceremony ended. If a lord had no heir under his name, his property would be claimed by the duchy once he had passed away. Such a change would be devastating for everyone who depended on their livelihood under the family's name. That being said, while it was rather tragic for Abel to leave his original home, it was also something truly worthy of celebration for the ones who took him in. The Knight of Bennet didn't participate in the welcome banquet. He wasn't interested in celebrating his son leaving. After the adoption ceremony was over, he hastily went home with his men. Out of understanding for what the Knight of Bennet was feeling, the Knight of Marshall spent no effort in trying to make him stay. After the day was over, the Knight of Marshall took Abel to a 2-story tall building on the left side of the Harry Castle. "This will be your room from now on." The Knight of Marshall opened the door and welcomed Abel in. "I hope you feel at home here." There was a lot of space on the first floor. The floor was made of some very hard rocks. At the edge were a table and some chairs for the guests, but that was about the only regular furniture here. The wall was stacked with a rack full of weapons. There were heavy swords, shields, bows, and lances. There was even a heavy axe that was only supposed to be wielded by the orcs. To be honest, this place felt more like a mini training room than a living room. As the base for a novice knight like Abel, pretty much all his daily needs could be fulfilled here. Credits could be given to the Knight of Marshall. He had put in his thoughts when he decorated this whole building. The bedroom was up on the second floor. There was a very big, feathery bed that was almost too clean. Whether it was the oak wood wall or the wool carpet on the floor, everything had a glorious tone of white to it. As if this wasn't grandiose enough, the window was stretched from floor to ceiling. If you look outside, the view was much prettier than what you'd expect from regular homes. The Knight of Marshall liked the color white. It must have something to do with the unicorn on his family's coat of arms. Even the big closet in Abel's room was made of white oak timber. "Don't you worry about what to wear here." The Knight of Marshall opened up the closet, which had all kinds of new clothes inside. "These are all yours. It's going to be a while before your welcome party. Get some shower now. After you've got yourself some good rest, a maid will come to help you change into your formal attire." The Knight of Marshall was a kind man. When he smiled at Abel, there was a certain warmth that felt both genuine and comforting. "Is there anything else that you want?" he asked once more before he went downstairs. "Don't hold back. This is your home from now on." "No, sir. This is already more than what I could ask," Abel said in a slightly anxious tone. As much as he appreciated the generosity of everyone in this castle, it was hard to get used to being this cared for by so many people at once. While alone in his new bedroom, Abel took a look outside the floor-to-ceiling window for some nighttime scenery. There were multiple dots of light flashing over the distance, most of which belonged to the guests who came over to the welcome banquet. All in all, the Harry Castle was very close to Harvest City, which had a scale far greater than a small town like Fort Lee. This was Abel's new home from now on. He had just begun to acknowledge his new family, but fate decided to bring him out of his home, and here he was. A new family, a new life. Abel couldn't help but shake his head and let out a deep sigh. Once he became old and strong enough, he swore that he would do anything he could to help out his parents and brother. There were sounds of footsteps coming by the stairs. It was a maid, and she had just opened the bedroom door and came in. She was about 20 years old, and her face was round like a bun. "Your bath water is ready now," she said humbly, as if she didn't want to bother Abel too much. "Do you want to wash now?" With the maid leading his way, Abel came to a bathroom that was only meant for the Harry Castle's masters. Strangely, everything was made of timber here, and that gave off this unique fragrance like what you would find in a sauna. The bathing tub was made of marbles, and there were dry flower petals sprinkled on top of the steaming hot water. Just when the maid was about to go in with Abel, she was ordered to stay where she was at. Abel might not look like it, but he was raised to follow the customs of the modern age. Having a female wash his body was not something he would feel comfortable with. Once he had washed, Abel had the maid help him get into his formal attire. While standing in front of the castle gate, the servants were busy welcoming the guests who had been invited by the Knight of Marshall. From lords of neighboring lands and royals living inside Harvest City, everyone who paid their visit tonight had some type of reputation to their name. This just showed how resourceful the Knight of Marshall really was. The banquet was to be held in the castle's main hall. There were hundreds of giant smokeless candles being lit across the building. For the supper tonight, there was some fine wine transported from Bakong City and some freshly cooked beasts that were just hunted from the forest. As the night approached, almost all the guests had made their way into the ballroom. No one would be late for an event like this, of course. While nighttime entertainment was plentiful on planet Earth, things get pretty dull in this world at night. The poor couldn't afford lanterns, so they would just sleep when the moon had made its appearance. The rich, on the other hand, had nothing else to do but to read books in the basements. The theater was an option if you lived in the city, but the shows were not displayed at every single night. It was very expensive to hold a banquet as big as this one. Most noblemen could only afford one or two in a year. Their wallets would be empty if they decided to go any further. Come to think of it, there was no banquet back at the Bennett Knight's domain. Abel didn't know how the Knight of Marshall managed his finances, but there was probably a lot the Knight of Bennett could learn from him. Since Abel was the star tonight, he and the Knight of Marshall had to wait on the second floor before making their entrance. They would only come out after the butler Lindsay had introduced him to the guests. "Thank you all for coming here," Lindsay called out in his fancy black suit. "Please, let's welcome the honorable owner of this estate, the Knight of Marshall. And let's welcome Abel, who is our new master of the Marshall family." The guests all started clapping as the Knight of Marshall and Abel came down the stairs. While Abel just kept on nodding his head to greet him, the Knight of Marshall seemed much more composed in this kind of situation. He held his head high, had a confident, wide grin on his face, and rose his cup for a celebratory toast with everyone. The Knight of Marshall was the only one that Abel recognized. Besides, as a young boy of 13, it wasn't like he was going to be invited to dance with any girls. The guests would say hello to him, but that was about it. The most he could do was to greet back at him and carry on. "Look at that lucky kid with his dark hair. Yeah, he's really lucky, isn't he? Hey, why is it him and not me? You. Come on, it should have been me. I look better than you on any given day." As Abel turned to the source of the noise, he could see a bunch of young men joking amongst themselves. They didn't seem to notice him, though, until he came a bit closer. Things started getting awkward real quick at that point. A young man in white suit bowed and apologized. "Sorry, we didn't notice that you're here." "No need for apologies," Abel greeted back with a bow of his own. "I was the one who interrupted your conversation." Abel was technically a middle-aged man. Upon his arrival at the Harry Castle, he had already prepared himself for any gossip that could go behind his back. Besides, these boys were just having a chat. There was no big deal about that. From what it looked like, these few youngsters took a liking in Abel's cool demeanor. They started dragging him into their little group and started talking about gossip together. At one point, they discussed how a lord found himself a new lover. Another time, it was about someone who caught some kind of prey. The man in the white suit was Isaac, the oldest son of Baron Victor. He was the one who brought up Abel back then. Being adopted by an heirless knight was considered as extremely lucky, and Abel happened to be one who has won the jackpot. Baron Victor, who was one of the many barons living inside Harvest City. Overall, barons lived a comfortable life wherever they were, but most of them still had to work for their lavish expenses. To be a nobleman, one had to spend quite some gold for all sorts of things. This was why noblemen tended to engage in the trading business. While such practices were considered lowly to the eyes of the aristocrats, they had no other choices but to learn to live with it. They had no lands of their own. Even someone like the Knight of Bennett was considered better than him because, well, at least he owned his piece of land. No land, and no castle. This was why the barons could only live in the city. Life was convenient here, but nothing could be freer than living in your own castle. Besides, owning a piece of land was the same as having a secured source of income. It would mean securing the funding of your own troops and being able to grow your own crops. No wonder Isaac sounded so sour back then. As long as there was no ill intention behind it, Abel didn't mind being the target of jealousy. While sipping his wine, Abel listened to the conversation between these young men. He would occasionally say something as to not appear unsocial to them, but he also tried not to be too intrusive while doing so. Everything was seemingly well until he felt a menacing stare. Abel wasn't sure what was going on, so he just pretended to not notice it. His eyes were scanning across the crowd, though, and his hand still waggling onto that wine glass he was holding. It was a young man. He had an upright stature, a handsome-looking face, and blonde hair that was combed as neatly as it could get. His eyes were rather slanted, however, and that somehow made him look more feminine than he should be. Abel lightly tapped Isaac on his arm. "Who is that?" "Him." Daniel threw a quick glance at the boy, but quickly turned his head back in disgust. "Oh, his name is Daniel. If you ask me, he's as slimy as it gets." "Why would you say that?" Abel asked in curiosity. "Well, his father was a merchant, but his older sister got married to Lord Walker and makes him half a nobleman. You'd think he'd be satisfied with that, but oh no. After hearing about how the Knight of Marshall didn't have an heir, he started begging his sister to help him get adopted. His sister couldn't do anything about it, of course, so she asked Lord Walker to talk directly with the Knight of Marshall. He did, and the Knight of Marshall turned him down right away. Isaac seemed keen to talk about this kind of stuff. You know what the other nobles say about this? It's been a real hot topic amongst themselves lately. Isaac paused for a bit more of his wine. He wanted to see some sort of reaction from Abel, but was slightly let down by how calm this young boy was being. "They've been saying that, good boy. Daniel doesn't know his place. Can you believe that? Not just him, everyone's been making fun of Lord Walker. He kind of deserved it too, to be honest. What kind of knight would take in the son of a merchant? Even if the Knight of Marshall said yes, his whole family wouldn't agree to that." Thanks to how gossipy Isaac was getting, he pretty much told Abel everything he knew about Daniel. Because of him, Abel was starting to understand why Daniel had such a dislike for him from the very start. But still, Abel didn't like talking behind other people's backs. He thought it was boring, and to be fair, most of the information that was thrown around was nothing but rumors. After spending a few more minutes with these youngsters, he said goodbye to them and went to the toilet. Oddly enough, Daniel saw this and went to the toilet as well. Abel didn't go in the toilet. Instead, he went to a nearby window for some fresh air. His 12-year-old body was not quite used to having liquor yet. While the chilling night wind was blowing on his face, he reminded himself that he wasn't going to have any alcohol from here on. For crying out loud, he was a former bodybuilding trainer. He knew better than to engage in underage drinking. As the host of today's event, it would be rude to be absent for too long. But just as Abel was about to walk back to the hall, someone suddenly started charging towards him. Abel was fast enough to react to this, so he started activating his level 4 novice night power. Whoever this fool was, he didn't make Abel flinch. If anything, after running into him, he was bounced back 3 meters from where he came from. His body flew in the air for a while, and his body started sliding for an extra 2 meters before he finally stopped. Realizing that there was a situation going, people started coming over for a look. It's Daniel. A knight came and turned over the body of the attacker. A young woman in fluffy skirts starting running over. Oh my. Dear Daniel, what happened to you? Abel, what just happened? The Knight of Marshall came and demanded an explanation. I'm not sure why that Abel opened his arms to feign ignorance. He started charging at me. Next thing I know, his whole body started flying away. The Knight of Marshall didn't see it himself, but it wasn't hard for him to figure out what actually happened. Abel was a newcomer to this castle. He barely knew anyone, which meant that he had no motive to hurt anyone. And even if he was trying to show Daniel who's boss, it was unlikely for him to do it on the day of his welcome banquet. As for Daniel, the Knight of Marshall knew who he was. After rejecting this young man's imprudent request, he remembered being mocked by his friends for turning him down so quickly. If it wasn't because of Lord Walker, he would very much like to teach this young man a lesson in proper etiquette. And here they were. The Knight of Marshall didn't want to cause anything big, but what Daniel had done was unforgivable. At a banquet held by the Knight of Marshall, he decided to assault the future heir of the Marshall family. Abel was already a noble now, which made the crime twice as severe than it already was. While paying no attention to the crying young woman nearby, the Knight of Marshall called out to Lord Walker, who was still standing back in the crowd. Sir Walker, so what is the purpose of you bringing Daniel to my castle? Is this an attempt to ridicule the Harry family? Or are you trying to set up a duel with me on behalf of your family name? Lord Walker had quite a displeased look on his face when he saw Daniel on the ground. Honestly, he would have never brought Daniel here if he knew how feral the boy would be. Daniel was begging him to let him have a look at the next heir of the Harry family. That was the only reason he was allowed to tag along. Lord Walker gave a deep bow to the Knight of Marshall. I'm sorry for this, sir. Someone like him should have never been allowed to attend an event like this. Please settle this in whatever ways that you see fit. Whilst acknowledging the apology with a nod, the Knight of Marshall pointed his finger towards Daniel. Guard. Send him to prison. I want him to be trialed in Bakong City by tomorrow. No, you can't do this, the woman cried even louder, but she was quickly dragged away by Lord Walker. The two left the castle before the banquet had even ended. While watching from the side, the butler Lindsay rubbed his chin with his hand. He witnessed the confrontation from start to finish. There was a good chance that he had discovered something. The banquet went back to normal quite quickly after that. No one was going to pay too much attention to the sad bastard who offended a knight, especially when that bastard wasn't even a nobleman. Once the banquet was over, all the guests were led to the guest room. The butler Lindsay then came to the Knight of Marshall, who was busy cleaning his armor. What? The Knight of Marshall dropped his cherished armor on the ground. Abel is a rank 4 novice knight. Are you sure about this? Yes, sir, the butler Lindsay asserted. While I am only a rank 5 warrior, the energy Sir Abel released back then was, without a doubt, something that would only belong to a rank 4 novice knight. Ha ha ha, the Knight of Marshall laughed frantically as he started slapping the table with his hand. Seth is going to be so pissed about this. If only he knew that his son was a genius. Oh, but he doesn't know, does he? Why else would he give Abel to me? From what I've heard, Lindsay lowered his voice for a reminder, the eldest son of the Bennett family is still a rank 4 novice knight, and he is 18 right now. Yes, despite being wrong about Abel's intentions, the Knight of Marshall felt moved by Abel's decision to hide away his real power. Abel is a good child. He didn't want to discourage his older brother, so he's been hiding his real potential this entire time. Send a letter to the old men at Bakong City. I want him to know about this, the Knight of Marshall commanded, then took a look at the armor he had just dropped. Another thing. I want a full set of the Blazing Sun armor. When I left the place years ago, what they gave me was fake. Now I've brought a super genius into the family. They ought to do more to reward me this time. No. Yes, master, the butler Lindsay replied. He didn't mind if his master sounded a little brash there. For the Knight of Marshall, his passion for the Blazing Sun armor was just as strong as his love for his deceased wife. The Blazing Sun armor was the standard military equipment of the Blazing Sun Empire, an ancient empire known for its spectacular army. Whenever the sun shone on a piece of the Blazing Sun armor, its surface would glow with a red identical to blood. Not only was it gorgeous to look at, but its defensive power was also, in every practical sense, something that every knight would want to lay their hands on. After the Blazing Sun Empire had lost its former glory, most of the armor was lost. The few that remained were collected by noblemen as antiques, and they were rarely found as items to be sold. It was now the second morning upon Abel's arrival. Having brushed himself off with the help of a maid, Abel came to the dining room for some breakfast. After seeing that the Knight of Marshall was already waiting for him, he quickly came to apologize. Sorry for making you wait, sir. That's okay. How's your sleep last night? The Knight of Marshall asked casually. Very good. The bed was very comfortable when I slept on it. It's good to hear that. The Knight of Marshall gestured Abel to come. Here, come have a seat. The servants started handing out the dishes after they've said the grace. Surprisingly enough, there were a lot of different things in Abel's plate: eggs, sausages, bacon, and green vegetables. Actually, there shouldn't be green vegetables this season. How did they get 'em here? Realizing the surprise on Abel's face, the Knight of Marshall explained, it's the work of the Druids. They used the special powers to grow these vegetables. The prices they sold these for are, well, very befitting of the status. Abel's heart started churning after hearing this. What other casters are there apart from the Druids? Seeing how interested Abel was about this topic, the Knight of Marshall put down his knife. You're talking about the wizards, aren't you? Wizards. So maybe that's why Abel couldn't use the Scroll of Town portal. Maybe magic scrolls were limited for the wizards. If Abel wanted to go home, he must find the chance to learn about the wizards. Once breakfast was over, the Knight of Marshall told Abel to come to his study. He poured a cup of coffee for Abel, and only spoke once Abel sipped it. Abel, you are already a member of the Harry family. The Knight of Marshall paused for a bit to find the right words. I think I should be honest with you. The power you released yesterday belongs to a rank 4 novice knight. Abel raised his head in shock. He didn't expect to be exposed to this quickly. In his defense, he only used his real power for only a few seconds. It's okay, the Knight of Marshall held onto Abel's shoulder. I know that you were watching out for your older brother. You didn't want to make him feel bad about himself, right? As far as that guess was from the actual truth, Abel didn't bother to give his explanation. If anything, that was a more reasonable explanation than talking about the Hereditary Cube and all that other nonsense. I'm going to be straight with you. I don't know how you're doing it, but it's not a good idea to suppress your powers. Knights are supposed to be fiery and explosive. Once you decide to hold it back, you start to lose your primitive drive. Do you know what I'm saying? From what the Knight of Marshall was saying, power seemed to be defined differently in this world. Back on planet Earth, one would be considered powerful if he could control his strength, but here, only untamable powers were considered the strongest. What Abel learned on Earth was about relaxation, conserving one's life forces. It was about surviving and living as long and healthy as possible. Since guns weren't invented yet in this world, nobody was looking to live as long as possible. The only thing they were thinking about was to outlive their enemies, which meant being better at killing than anyone else. How should I control my powers, then? Abel asked. I was in the same shoes as you many years ago. Luckily, I've found a solution already. The Knight of Marshall placed a long sword on the table. Look at this blade right here. As you know, swords are the most important weapons for a knight. How much do you know about this blade right here? Abel replied after handling the sword for a bit. This sword is 1 meter and 5. Its weight is around 20 pounds. The Knight of Marshall swung the sword for a bit. This long sword is designed for a knight. It has been forged for 100 times before it is in the shape that it's in now. The length of this piece is precisely 1.58 meters, and its weight is 21.2 pounds. Do you know why I know so much about it? Because it's yours, Abel said softly, to which the Knight of Marshall could hear very clearly. Seeing how unconvinced Abel was getting, he couldn't help but let out a soft chuckle. The Knight of Marshall grinned. How about that light sword you have on you? Do you know how long and heavy it is? For a moment, Abel didn't know what to say. He just rubbed his nose for a bit. Estimate by sight. If you work for an armor smith for about a year, you can do just as well as I can. You will have a better grip on your weapon than most trainers. At the same time, you'll be able to release all that power and frenzy within you, meanwhile still maintaining the same amount of control that you would normally. All right, you've convinced me. So where should I learn to make swords? The Knight of Marshall raised his cheek. You ever wondered how I got so rich? From what Abel could see, the Harry Knight's domain was no bigger than the Bennett Knight's domain. Frankly enough, though, the standard of living between the two was miles apart from each other. That being said, Abel wanted to ask about it since day one. You see, there is an iron mine on my property, the Knight of Marshall said proudly. I happened to found it right after I was given this piece of land. If it wasn't for that, I would have never built this castle the way Emma wanted me to. The Knight of Marshall seemed rather sad when he talked about his wife. When Emma was still with me, she drew the construction plan of this castle, but our savings alone were not enough for the job. We had a lot of faith, though, so we started building it anyways. And just when we were short on money, we happened to found that mine, and thank the heaven, we managed to fulfill our dreams together. The blacksmith was not located inside the castle. It was right next to the iron mine, which took Abel and the Knight of Marshall 20 minutes to arrive by chariots. Even from over a distance, Abel could hear the sound of iron ore being smashed by iron hammers. There was a pile of stone houses, all of which were made by some neatly chiseled boulders. There were chimneys on top of each of them. Right now, 4 out of 6 had dark smoke puffing out. Just by looking at these stone houses, Abel could tell that the Knight of Marshall paid a lot of attention to his blacksmith business. The boulders they used were the same as the ones they used for castles. Forget about their actual cost, it would have already cost so much just to carry them all the way from the mountains. The Knight of Marshall instructed Abel carefully. We're going to pay a visit to Master Bentham today. Remember to be respectful when you see him. I've invited him over because he's the best man I could find in Harvest City. If he wasn't trying to let his son take over his shop business, we wouldn't have a chance to see him today. Pleased to see you here, Marshall. Master Bentham greeted the Knight of Marshall with a simple nod. He was a very big man, standing at 2 meters tall. He had a very solid build. Even at 50-something of age, the big beard on his face gave a no-nonsense aura around the man. Hey there, the Knight of Marshall smiled without getting too much into formality. I've brought a young man to you today. Apparently, he's interested in becoming your disciple. Master Bentham looked quite perplexed when he laid his eyes on Abel. Are you talking about this child, Marshall? Please, I know the difference between a young man and a child. This boy is not even 14 yet, and you want him to be one of my disciples. Suddenly, a lot of people started coming over to see what was going on. Master Bentham, this is Abel, my new adopted son. He is currently a novice knight, and he wants you to teach him how to control his powers. Nice thinking. Sorry though, I'm not taking him in, Master Bentham said grimly. My training is not something a young nobleman can bear. Besides, I don't think a boy as young as he has the stamina to swing a hammer. Abel reached out his arm and flexed for a bit. Don't you worry about that, Master Bentham. I can work very hard if I want to, and you aren't the only muscular one here. Ha! Abel was about 1.6 meters. He did have some muscles, yes, but that was nothing compared to Mazer Bentham, who stood at bear-like height 2 meters. The stark contrast alone was enough to make everybody around laugh. 2 more years, Abel. Once you are a bit taller and stronger, I promise that I will teach you how to forge, Master Bentham said patiently out of respect for the Knight of Marshall. How strong do I need to be to train under you? Abel pressed on stubbornly. Master Bentham turned back towards the backyard. Come with me, he said, to which Abel did with the company of the Knight of Marshall. The other bystanders, too, came in to see if Abel was ready for the challenge ahead. How many do you think he can lift? I'd be impressed with 1. Nah, 2, he's a novice knight. I'll go with 2. I bet 1. I bet 2. As rowdy as the crowd was getting, both the Knight of Marshall and Abel paid no attention to it. When they arrived at the backyard, they saw a bunch of iron pieces being lined up on the ground. There was an iron bar in the middle, and varying sizes of iron pieces on each side going from small to large. They were essentially barbells. It was not very refined compared to the ones that Abel was familiar with, but the design was nevertheless the same. As it turned out, the cultural background had nothing to do with understanding how the human body functioned. I use these locks to train my disciples' strength. You see, they come in different sizes. The smallest ones are 50 pounds, the biggest ones 500. Whenever you go one size bigger, you increase the load by 50 pounds. Get over here, Geddon. Master Bentham pointed towards a man in the crowd. While he was pretty strong himself, this particular fellow was not much different in terms of stature. Master, Geddon explained anxiously as sweat streamed down his dark face. I wasn't being lazy. I was throwing out the metal waste. Everybody started laughing. Geddon was a familiar face here at the blacksmith shop. He was recruited after Master Bentham came to the Harry Castle. Whilst originally an apprentice, he quickly became a disciple because of how hard-working he was. There were a lot of differences between an apprentice and a disciple. Apprentices had it much worse because most of their work was centered around intense physical labor. Usually, it involved cutting and burning timber for the entire day. Even worse, there was no pay. Disciples, on the other hand, had the privilege to learn from their master directly. At the end of the month, they would also receive a wage that was equivalent to the quality of their work. Geddon was a very likable student to Master Bentham. He was honest, hard-working and willing to learn. Once Master Bentham retired, he would be the go-to person to continue serving the Knight of Marshall. No, Geddon, I'm telling you to come here so you can show Abel how to use the locks. Go ahead and teach him what it takes to be my disciple. Yes, sir. Geddon smiled modestly as he rubbed his hands together. He then walked to the third lock and turned his head towards Abel. Watch me closely, Abel. With his hands grasping both ends of the iron bar, Geddon let out a big shout and raised the 150-pound thing from the ground. Because of how easily it went over his head, it almost felt like he was picking up a straw or something. "Nice one, lad." With everyone cheering out for him, Geddon dropped the iron lock onto the ground. As Geddon turned to his master for some feedbacks, Master Bentham nodded his head in approval. "Keep going, Geddon." "Yes, sir." Geddon proceeded to the fourth lock, which was roughly 200 pounds in total weight. It wasn't that hard for him to lift it, though. He readied himself, grabbed onto the thing and picked it up. No drama. It wasn't so easy when he tried out the fifth one. Still, he managed to raise it over his head after a bit of hesitation. Things got tense when he walked over to the sixth lock. It was a 300-pound lock. Most people couldn't even hold one end for more than 3 seconds, let alone pick it up from the ground. Geddon didn't start right away this time. For a few seconds there, he closed his eyes and adjusted his breathing for a bit. Once he was ready, he let out a roar and veins started bursting out of his neck. His face was red like a tomato, except it looked like it was about to explode from the inside. Nevertheless, the lock went over his head. Everybody was yelling in celebration for him. "Very well, Geddon." Master Bentham gave a proud look. "Even with the strength you have now, you are still making progress every single day. It wouldn't be long before you can surpass even my limits." "Really?" Geddon scratched his head as he shied away from the compliment. "Or, you're being too kind, sir. There is still a lot I need to do before I can get to where you're at." "Your turn now, Abel." Master Bentham turned his head towards the boy who dared to challenge him. Contrary to what he had expected, Abel didn't back down after laying his eyes on Geddon's performance. Abel was already walking towards the third lock. To be clear, Abel did approve Geddon of his strength. That being said, there were absolutely no skills in the way he lifted those weights. For the millionth time, Abel was a former bodybuilding trainer. The barbell was one of his favorite pieces of equipment back on Earth. It was his job to be good at using it. If Geddon's maximum was around 300 pounds, he could probably lift to 350 pounds if he knew the right techniques. There were a lot of things that were wrong about his form. If he wasn't so strong already, he would be severely injured right now. Even if he wasn't injured, there was bound to be a lot of damage in the long term. He's going for the 150. Good grace, he's not going to do it. Is he mad? The crowd started being noisy again when it was Abel's turn. Abel frowned a little because of that. He didn't like being watched like he was some clown in a circus. "Out, thank you." Master Bentham shooed the crowd away. He could tell that Abel didn't like being watched. As for the reason for this, well, he just thought that Abel didn't want to be a laughing stock. Realizing that they've angered Master Bentham, the crowd started rushing out of the backyard. "Try your best, but don't push yourself too much," Master Bentham said. Since there was no drying powder here, Abel rubbed his hands with some mud he found on the ground. His mind might have been old, but his body still belonged to that of a child. With that being the case, it was very important for him to take care of himself in whatever small ways he could. Whilst standing in front of the 150-pound lock, Abel had his legs parallel to the middle of the bar. When he tightened his grip, his thumbs were separate from his other fingers. When he picked the lock above his head, he did it in one motion and had his arms completely straight while doing so. It was a beautiful lift, smooth and well coordinated. The lock was only 150 pounds, yes, but in Master Bentham's eyes, Abel clearly did it better than Geddon. Not only was he faster, but he also seemed more effortless when he was doing it. The Knight of Martial, on the other hand, was more focused on the way Abel used his muscles. He began by setting his feet up at a base, channeled his power through his thighs, waist and upper back, and executed the movement with his whole body moving in one with his arms. Abel might not know yet, but what he did was the same as strength conservation, which was an advanced technique of the Knights. For a child to have such a good understanding of muscle movement, Abel was truly blessed with talent. After dropping the 150 pounds, Abel walked towards the 200 pounds and easily raised it. His form was the same as last time, and his speed was just as fast. 250. Easy. And just like that, as Master Bentham and Geddon watched in total shock, Abel was already standing in front of the 300 pounds. This time, Abel had his hands closer to the middle of the bar. After doing a few prep hinges without any weight, he raised the lock and had it locked near his shoulder, meanwhile standing up with his legs slightly bent. His forearms were bent whilst pointing forward, and his chin was parallel to the bar. Then, slowly and steadily, he straightened his arms and raised the lock on top of his head. As though woken up from a dream, Master Bentham turned to the Knight of Marshall. "Where did you find this monster, Marshall?" The Knight of Marshall wasn't too pleased with what Master Bentham was saying. "Hey, who are you calling a monster here? He's a rank 4 novice knight, god damn it. If he can't even lift 300 pounds off the ground, what kind of rank 4 novice knight is he?" "Oh, my spirits," Master Bentham exclaimed as he looked towards Abel, "a rank 4 novice knight. How old are you, child?" "Turning 13 soon, sir," Abel replied. "You're 12. You're a 12-year-old, rank 4 novice knight." Master Bentham threw a dirty look at the Knight of Marshall. "Marshall, what kind of madman would send a genius like him to be your son?" "Why are you looking at me like that?" the Knight of Marshall cried out loud. "Hey, you. I'm an intermediate knight myself." "Yeah, but didn't you just become one?" "Marshall, isn't it better to send him to a commander? Actually, for someone as talented as him, you reckon we can send him to the head commander?" "Just don't you worry about it. Just let him stay with you and teach him how to forge, okay, friend?" The Knight of Marshall was a good friend with Master Bentham. If it wasn't for that, he would have never had him come over to the Harry Knight's domain. That being said, however, Master Bentham was quite a loudmouth. His straightforwardness has caused a lot of headaches in the past. "So be it then," Master Bentham agreed, but decided to keep on talking. "I'll let Abel stay, but are you sure you're the right man to teach Abel how to be a knight, Marshall?" "I'm just saying, the kid's got a bright future ahead of him." "All right, Abel, be a good boy for me. Stay here and learn from Master Bentham during the day. At night, you'll learn the techniques of a knight inside the castle." Having said that, the Knight of Marshall rushed out of the blacksmith shop. For a second there, he looked like he was trying to escape the scene here. Master Bentham, too, started walking back to his workshop. "You should have taught him the basics first, Geddon," he said before he left. Geddon said to Abel as it was just the two of them now. "Wow, Abel. You're pretty strong, aren't you?" "You are pretty strong yourself, Geddon," Abel replied. Even without being trained as a knight, Geddon was already strong enough as a normal human being. Geddon rejected the praise. "But I'm so much older than you. I'm already 19 and you're just 12. And look at how easy it was for you to lift the 300-pound lock. You seemed so confident when you were doing it. I'm sure you can lift more if you wanted to. You know, you can lift more if you know how to use all of your strength. If you want to, I can teach you how to lift those locks as I do." "Wow, are you sure?" Geddon almost jumped from where he was standing. "You think I can learn those techniques? Hey, how about we share what we know with each other? You teach me how to lift, and I'll teach you everything I know about forging. Not just forging. Feel free to ask me about anything that I might know." It was about 1 month since Abel's arrival at Harry Castle. There were about 3 days before New Year's Eve. For all the time he's been here, Abel pretty much spent all his time learning at the blacksmith shop. Thanks to Geddon, it wasn't hard for Abel to learn about the fundamentals of forging. He was actually in the middle of crafting a heavy sword for Zach, his beloved older brother. It was meant to be a New Year gift for him. Whilst holding onto a red-hot base with a pair of tongs, Abel smashed it into shape with a 10-pound hammer in his other hand. Since the base would start to cool down after a few minutes, Abel had to heat it in the stove every once in a while. Since this world was not yet industrialized, blacksmiths had to rely on very primitive techniques to forge their metals. To put it simply, the job was nothing more than heating metals, smashing them with a hammer, letting it cool down and repeating the whole process. As dull as that sounded, however, it was by no means something that anyone could do. The long sword Knight of Martial had was treated 100 times before the final product was finished. At best, an average blacksmith could only treat a base for about 30 to 40 times. Geddon was the disciple of Master Bentham, so he could do about 60. Only a master could make a base that's been treated for 100 times. Having read a few scientific catalogues himself, it wasn't hard for Abel to understand the theory behind such forging methods. By repeatedly hammering the base, it essentially eliminated the amount of carbon inside. This meant that the more it was treated, the purer the resulting metal would be. Having used the hammer for about a month, Abel was already pretty skilled with the art of forging. For a child as bright as him, he could now pinpoint the exact spot he needed to hit. Speaking of which, the base he was working on had already been treated for 50 times. At that stage, it became very difficult to shape the base into its desired shape. Not only would the base be extremely dense to mold, but the blacksmith would also be too tired to swing his hammers. Not Abel though. Even after treating the base for a total of 50 times, he was still swinging his arms at a very steady pace. Master Bentham knew about this, of course. Even without having taught Abel anything directly, he's been keeping a close watch this whole time. Master Bentham didn't teach Abel himself because there wasn't a need to. Abel was bound to be a knight, so the most he ought to learn about forging were pretty much just the basics. Besides, Geddon had been learning from Master Bentham for about 5 years already. In that sense, he was qualified to be supervising a young apprentice like Abel. Whenever Master Bentham saw Abel forging a base, there was always a bizarre sense of harmony lingering in the air. Abel wasn't fast. It would take about 1 second for him to swing once with his hammer. Technically, this wasn't too hard to do. Anyone could swing a 10-pound hammer for a few hundred times. But to treat a base 50 times, that would take about tens of thousands of continuous swinging from morning to noon. You'd have to keep doing this without any time for rest. Truth be told, Abel came up with this way of hammering the base. He got his idea from boxing. To throw a heavy punch, one could not just rely solely on the power of his arms. It was about using every part of your point and concentrating all that power into one point. This was exactly what Abel was doing. For every swing of his hammer, he was channeling his strength from his feet to his arms. And when the hammer hit the base, he would use the reaction force to his advantage and raise the hammer back to its original height. As energy efficient as this technique was, it was difficult to perform it. Abel, however, had more than enough time on his hands. With the right amount of practice and knowledge, he soon found himself the ideal ways to forge a metal base. Why does this child have to be a novice knight? Master Bentham would often ask himself. Someone as talented as Abel should have never been learning how to fight on a battle's front line. With Abel's ability to learn and the level he was currently, he would be a master blacksmith if he was to spend a few more years in the workshop. It was sad, yes, but that was just how things were. Having forgotten to eat his lunch, Abel was finally able to treat the base for a total of 80 times before 2 in the afternoon. He decided to stop after that. After a base was treated for 80 times, he could no longer hammer it with even all of his strength. Master Bentham grabbed a 30-pound hammer from the table. Whilst throwing a base into the stove, he looked into the flames and said, Abel, you are the most talented child that I've ever seen. What I'm about to show you, I will only do it once. You see how much you can learn from it." After saying that, Master Bentham took out a base and placed it on an anvil. He held his hammer up high, and for a few seconds there, he took a careful look at the base before he dropped his hammer on it. The way he swung the hammer was very slow, but the power he put in was nevertheless more intense than most men could produce. It was so intense that the whole workshop was shaking for a bit. Once you treat a base for about 80 times, it becomes so hard that you wouldn't be able to shape it with a hammer. Even if you can, though, all you're going to do is to destroy its interior structure. So, with that in mind, we're going to use a big hammer from now on. Be careful, though. You need to be very precise in the spots that you're hitting, but you must always maintain a high level of force that you put in. Master Bentham instructed Abel as he demonstrated, "You're a strong boy, Abel. If you put in the effort, I'm sure that you'll learn to do this correctly." Abel was paying very close attention to the base. Whenever Master Bentham dropped the hammer, it was always towards the spots with this soft, almost invisible lining. He could just barely see them because the base was glowing in dark red. Somehow, however, Master Bentham was able to strike the linings without failing a single time. Even more impressive, every one of his strikes had changed the shape of the base, and every time this happened, he would have to relocate the linings. After treating the base for the 81st time, Master Bentham threw it back to the stove and said, "Abel, try it," he ordered as he passed over the hammer. Abel took out the base and started looking for the linings on it. It was hard to find it at first, so he stared more intensively at the base surface. The more he stared at it, the less he became aware of his surroundings. It was a weird sensation to have. Everything else just vanished from his line of vision, and all that remained was the base itself, which became larger and larger in Abel's eyes. Even the most minute details were ingrained into his photographic brain cells. "Aha, there you are," Abel celebrated in his mind and immediately proceeded to drop the 30-pound hammer. The banging noise was extremely loud, but that didn't affect him for a bit. As soon as he found the next spot of the linings, he raised his hammer and continued his forging. It was like playing with a new toy. Whenever the base turned into a new shape, the linings would reappear at completely different spots. Abel was getting better at this the more he tried. Eventually, he was smashing the thing at the same pace as Master Bentham. Master Bentham was petrified by this. Whilst unintentional, Abel made him feel jealous. Yes, a master just got jealous of a child who spent no longer than a month learning how to forge. "It's the power of the will," Master Bentham called out repeatedly in his mind. He knew exactly what drove Abel to be so successful in his forge. His own teacher, Robin, was a forging master who was blessed with the same kind of ability. Unlike Master Bentham, who only got his title because of his reputation within Harvest City, Master Robin was a genuine master who was acknowledged by the entire continent. Because of his lack of the power of the will, Master Bentham had to go home after learning from Master Robin for 10 years. As unfortunate as that was, he did improve his skills with hard work and experience. This was why he could continue to treat a base when it had already been treated for more than 80 times. When Master Bentham started his quest to be the best blacksmith he could ever be, he saw how Master Robin used his power of the will to locate the linings on a base. It was the same method as the one that Abel used. He knew it all too well. Master Bentham didn't stop Abel after that. As he slowly left the workshop, he decided in his mind. He would let Abel help him fulfill a dream that he couldn't accomplish himself. Abel was in too much focus to notice any of that. He just kept on putting the base in the stove, taking it out of the stove, and repeating the whole process for another couple of hours. 82, 83, 84.98, 99, 100. Abel came back to his senses after treating the base for the 100th time. All of a sudden, he felt sick and tired at every spot of his body. His mind, too, felt extremely drained out. It was like having your brain plucked out of you, which was not a good feeling to have at all. As the urge to vomit came to him, the hammer slid out of his hand and dropped on the workshop table. After that, his right hand was spasming like a duckling on a winter night. He tried to remember what it was like to be in that zone back then. On the one hand, it felt like he had no control of his own body. On the other hand, he felt like he was acting purely out of his instincts. Whatever the case was, it was a condition that was too much for him to handle. Abel turned on his senses for a while. To his surprise, there was a massive amount of chi circulating near his meridian. It was like nothing he had ever seen before. Without paying attention to how dirty the floor was, Abel quickly sat down for a night's breathing session. He was on his way to forming the 5th meridian. "What are you doing, Abel?" Geddon came in and asked. Just when he was about to lift Abel, Master Bentham stood in the way, threw a stare at him. "Don't move him." Master Bentham scoffed at Geddon. "Why are you so clumsy with everything that you do?" When the other apprentices were about to come in, Master Bentham quickly shooed him away with his hands. "Tell the Knight of Martial to come here." Master Bentham turned towards Geddon. "Yes, sir." Geddon complied and ran out of the blacksmith shop. Fucking Marshall and his bullshit luck, Master Bentham cursed to himself as it was just him and Abel now. Would you look at that? His adopted son just had another rank up. In Master Bentham's defense, he had every reason to be annoyed by the progress Abel was making. It was a very rare thing to become a rank 5 novice knight in just half an hour. That being said, even Abel didn't know why he was so successful this time. He didn't take any potion this time, and it was only a month since his last rank up. With so many questions in his mind, Abel stood up from the ground and found that everyone was standing very far from him. Well, except for Master Bentham. At least he had the decency to not make a child feel isolated. As unbothered as Abel was, he did appreciate that. Bang! A large shadow came in as the front door was kicked open. "What happened, Abel?" it asked with a loud roar. It was the Knight of Martial. After running for a few minutes, his long golden hair was half drenched in his own sweat. After seeing how well Abel was, he gave a loud, angry yell towards everyone in his sight. "Geddon, how dare that lad trick me? Come out now, I'll teach you a lesson right here." Master Bentham ground his teeth at the lucky bastard who took Abel in, who's trying to mess with my disciple. Uncle Marshall," Abel said timidly, "I just had another rank up." "What rank up?" "Just you wait for me, boy. Let me have a word with Bentham first." "Wait, you had another rank up?" The Knight of Martial was about to have a chat with Master Bentham, but what Abel was saying had him frozen on the spot. He scanned his eyes across Abel from top to bottom. Then, as he pushed Abel with one of his hands, Abel responded by releasing his newly found power. What? The Knight of Martial cried out loud. "That doesn't even make sense. You can't just rank up like that. What were you doing back there?" Abel replied after thinking to himself for a while. "Nothing much. I was busy treating my base in the workshop." "You ate anything today?" Abel replied compliantly since he was just as puzzled. "I ate my breakfast with you, Uncle Marshall. I skipped lunch because I was busy forging my base." "How's that even possible? You ranked up by hitting some metal with a hammer." "What? How about I come here to hit some metal tomorrow?" The Knight of Martial pointed a finger at Master Bentham. "That's ridiculous. If forging is all you need to rank up, this fellow would have been a master warrior years ago." Master Bentham said sarcastically, "Yeah, sure, just come here and do some forging for me tomorrow. Of course, you can rank up by hitting some metal. You just need to be in the right condition when you're doing it." Oh really? The Knight of Marshall widened his eyes. Hey Abel, why don't you forge another base right now? Go be in that condition, or whatever you call it, and you'll be the youngest knight in the duchy. Both Master Bentham and Abel had to cover their faces after hearing that remark. Although Abel graduated to a level 5 novice knight, he still felt very low in energy. Seeing Abel looking like this, Mater Bentham immediately told him to get some rest. With the help of Knight of Marshall, Abel left the blacksmith shop. As soon as they left the blacksmith shop, Abel noticed Knight of Marshall's private carriage rushing towards them from a distance. At that moment Abel immediately looked down at the Knight of Marshall's boots. It was full of dirt. Normally it would have taken the carriage around 20 minutes to get here from the castle. Therefore Knight of Marshall must have run here by himself as soon as he heard the news. Knight of Marshall was a royal and the owner of a fiefdom. Therefore, if anyone found out that he was madly running around like this, it wouldn't do any good to his dignity. However, because of Abel, the Knight of Marshall was willing to take this risk. After seeing the Knight of Marshall with a face full of joy, Abel also began to feel warm inside. He could not believe a famous knight such as Knight of Marshall was not only happy for his level up but also willing to go through all of this. At that moment Abel couldn't help but said softly, "Uncle Marshall, thank you for everything you have done for me." "Don't think too much, kid," said Knight Marshall as he patted Abel on the head. After they settled on the carriage immediately began to set off towards the sunset. Ding, ding, ding. The early next morning Abel had already arrived at the blacksmith shop. He asked Master Bentham if he could have a training room all by himself. Master Bentham knew that today Abel would try to forge a big sword for the first time and wanted to remain in focus, so he had agreed. However, Abel's intention was not only to remain focused, but he also didn't want anyone to find out how he forged the sword. This is because he would be using some techniques that no one had ever seen in this world before. It was the carburizing and quenching techniques he learned on a science TV programs from Earth. To achieve this, during the forging process, the back of the blade needed to be continuously refined to reduce its carbon content. The lesser the carbon content, the higher the quality the back of the blade could become. However, once the blade had formed its shape, if you used the carburizing technique to add some carbon back into the edge blade, it would greatly enhance its toughness. Afterward, Abel placed the already formed big sword into a specially made crucible and buried it with some charcoal, soybean paste, and soil he had prepared a few days ago. It fit perfectly. Then, he sealed up the crucible and put it in the furnace for heating. Charcoal and soybean paste were naturally used for carburizing while the soil acted as a dispersing agent. The advantage of carburizing technology was that the carbon would be distributed very evenly throughout the sword. On top of that, the carbon potential would also be high. Therefore, this technique was not only effective but also very efficient. This technique was still being used on modern Earth today. It was called the steel method. When it comes to quenching, this world also had a similar method, which was throwing the sword into cold water for cooling. However, due to the rapid thermal expansion, it could also increase the number of waste products, which could throw the concentration of the metal. Therefore, it could sometimes cause a crack on the sword after being quenched. However, the quenching method used by Abel was a bit more unique. According to the science program, it was an ancient sword forging technique. After the sword had cooled down, Abel took it out of the quenching bucket. He flicked the face of the sword with his finger. It made a crisp sound. Although it was still hard to tell if the sword was high quality, it was complete nevertheless. Abel then immediately called the servant to clean up the mess in the operation room. He did not want to leave any trace for people to discover what had done. In this world, inventions or creations like this could cause a disaster. "Geddon, can you find someone to make a sword handle for me?" Abel asked embarrassingly to Geddon, who was busy doing his work. Sword handles were made out of all kinds of material, iron, wood, and horns. Abel had never learned the art of sword handle engraving, so he could only ask Geddon for help. "Is this the first big sword you made?" asked Geddon, took the big sword from Abel's hand and looked at it carefully. Suddenly he said in an excited, hoarse voice, "Is this a sword of 100 skills? On my God, this is the sword of 100 skills." Geddon had followed Master Bentham for 5 years, but could only forge a sword of 60 skills. Forging a sword of 100 skills had always been his dream. "Young Master Abel, you are a genius." Geddon sincerely praised Abel with all his heart. He then gently stroked the back of the blade with his hand as though he had found something. He then put his ear against the back of the sword and flicked it with a finger to listen to the echo. "No way, this is impossible." Although the performance of this sword seemed like the sword of 100 skills, it was a lot tougher than those that he had seen. Master Bentham would normally forge a sword of 100 skills every month, and they were the main sources of income in Harry's castle. Geddon not only closely watched the master make these swords, but he was also responsible for maintaining the condition of these swords. Therefore he was a lot more familiar with swords on 100 skills than most people. However, the surface of the big sword Abel made was strange. It was very different from the ones Master usually forged. Geddon couldn't specifically pinpoint what exactly was the difference, but from his experience, he knew this sword was much higher quality than the ordinary sword of 100 skills. To verify this, Geddon used the big sword to cut a piece of wood that was ready to be used as fuel. It was almost effortless. The big sword slid over the wood like a hot knife on cream, silently divided the wood piece into two. "How did you make this big sword?" Geddon was anxious to know more about the sword. "I just forged it according to your guidance, and Master Bentham helped me when I encountered difficulties," Abel explained. Geddon had been lied to. He thought the reason why the sword was so great was all because Master Bentham had helped Abel complete it. Therefore, he could not help but make up his mind and double down his training, hoping one day he could also forge a weapon like this. "I have collected some very good horns, perfect to use it as the handle for this big sword. I will help you install it tonight along with the scabbard. Can you leave this sword with me?" However, Geddon had another intention. The way this sword was forged was way too strange. He wanted to spend the night closely inspecting it, hoping he could also improve his skills. That night Geddon did not sleep at all. He installed a sword handle made with the best horns and found a crocodile skin scabbard. Afterward, he inspected the strange sword in great detail under the oil lamp. By the morning, Geddon came back to the blacksmith shop holding the big sword. He was astonished by his nice inspection. If it wasn't for fear of breaking Abel's sword, he would have liked to strike this sword with another sword of 100 skills in the master's warehouse to see which one is tougher. "Geddon, what's wrong with you?" asked Master Bentham suspiciously after seeing the redness of Geddon's eyes. How could an honest man like Geddon not sleep for a night? "Master, I've been thinking about the sword you made for Abel, and I could not understand," said Geddon, scratching his head while looking at Master Bentham in embarrassment. He wondered if he was just too stupid. Master Bentham took the big sword from Geddon and pulled it out. He said, "This is the big sword that Abel had forged yesterday. I only guided him on how to refine the thickness of the sword the day before yesterday. When you reach a bottleneck at 80 skills, I will teach you as well." So this is the big sword, the one that Abel forged. Master Bentham was also a little bit surprised. Master Bentham's experience was of course much higher than Geddon's. He guessed the technique applied in this sword could very well be a secret technique passed down by a family to enhance the weapon's hardness and sharpness. Although the master was very tempted, he also knew that trying to spy on a family's secret technique was making that family your biggest enemy. It didn't matter if the technique was from the Harry family or the Bennet family. Well, that explained it. No wonder why Abel asked for a separate operation room yesterday. It turned out that Abel was using a family secret technique to refine the big sword. Therefore Master Bentham warned Geddon to stop asking Abel about the sword and pretend that nothing had ever happened. At Bennet Castle. Today was the last day of the year, and tomorrow would be the new year. During dinner, the Knight of Bennet took out the letter rectangle parcel and handed him over to Zack. This is a New Year's gift from Abel. Look how good he is to you. Even Mother and I did not get any. It must have seemed like Knight of Bennet was being salty. Nora rolled her eyes and said, "Our son had only been gone for a month and he has not stopped writing letters to us. Do you really want a present that badly?" Zack took the letter and parcels. But as he was opening it, he realized that within the parcel was a large sword. Wow, this is a master-level sword of 100 skills. Zack immediately recognized the sword as he took it out of the cover. A sword of 100 skills had always been a demanding piece in the market. Although it has a crazy price of 1,000 gold coins, there were still countless wealthy people rushing to buy it. Big swords were a knight's most significant possession. Despite just being made fun of by his wife seeing the sword of 100 skills when he only had a sword of 80 skills. Knight of Bennet couldn't help but exclaim, "I really do want a present. Let me have a look." As a knight, the Knight of Bennet could not resist the temptation for good weaponry. He took the sword from Zack's hand and began waving it in the middle of the dining room. This kid Abel, he hasn't even fully settled down at Harry's castle, and he's already begun to take random things from it, making it gifts. Next time I will write him a letter giving him a good lecture about this. "That's not the case," said Zack as he opened up Abel's letter. In the letter, Abel said that this is the first weapon he ever forged and decided to give me a New Year's gift. The Knight of Bennet suddenly stopped waving the sword in midair. He stared at Zack's letter and asked, "Did you say Abel had forged this sword himself?" "Yes, father," Abel said it very clearly in the letter. Zack answered with certainty. "Impossible. Marshall has also learned how to forge in the past, but the most he could make after a whole year of training was a table knife." "You are telling me that Abel could forge a sword of 100 skill after 1 month?" The Knight of Bennet felt like he made a big mistake for giving Abel away. At first, he thought he would only regret this decision after a few years, but now, he was completely lost for words. It had been a very unusual New Year within the Bennet Castle, with Zack's surprise, Bennet's regret, and Nora's sentiment. Yet Abel was unaware of this in Harry's castle. At Harry's castle, the Knight of Marshall and Abel were sitting in a carriage on the way to Harvest City to attend the New Year cocktail party hosted by Viscount Dickens. The party was supposed to start at night, but the Marshall Knight and Abel had already set off early in the morning. The road from Knight of Marshall's castle to Harvest City was constructed very well. The entire road was made out of small flat stones with a slight curve bulging out of the middle. Therefore, you could barely feel any vibration on the carriage, and in only an hour they had already traveled for more than 100 kilometers. From afar, Harvest City looked just a crouching tiger. However, one could only feel its majestic grandeur from up close. It was the largest city in Duchy of Carmel. Its surrounding walls were up to 20 meters high with dozens of cannons penetrating from the sides. All of this just showed how well guarded the city was. "Uncle Marshall, why is Harvest City so strictly guarded?" Abel asked as he stared at the 20-meter-high wall and the countless numbers of defensive weapons. Abel elaborated his question. Harvest City was located in the southernmost part of the Holy Land, which was once a territory that belonged to the humans. It was also said to be separated from the Orc Empire by one of the safest duchies. So why does the city look like it's about to be in a war? Abel, there is at least one official knight in every block of Duchy of Carmel, and Harvest City is no exception. Its city owner, the Honorable Viscount Dickens, was also the leader of the city's knights. The eyes of the Knight of Marshall had become somewhat dreary. He seemed engrossed in his memories. "It's all because of the Orc Empire," he sighed. The Orc Empire is located in the far north. It was guarded by one of mankind's greatest lions, who were the Miracle City's defense guards. Abel knew about the Miracle City defense guards. If it wasn't for their efforts to fight off the orcs, humans would have lost a great amount of land to live on. The orcs were the most bloodthirsty beings in this world. Due to their insanely high birth rate, they were always in a constant food crisis. As a means to avoid starvation, they would wage war against other races for food at the same time. This would also effectively reduce the number of mouths they had to feed. There were always humans who had lived near the Orc Empire. As they were an easy target to be pillaged, they gathered themselves up and built a military fortress alongside the passage of the Budapest Mountains, separating the human civilization and the Orc Empire. That construction was known as Miracle City. As long as the Miracle City is there, we don't need to worry about an orc invasion, the Knight of Marshall said. In the past few decades, the Orc Empire has developed a new way of attack. They used flying beasts to carry them over the Budapest Mountains and destroyed our back force. He said in a somewhat skeptical tone, "It's destruction indeed, but I believe it's more like a trial attack." As they were speaking, the carriage reached the gate of Harvest City. There was a long queue in front of a 10-meter-high gate. Next to the gate, there were a bunch of soldiers checking and charging the visitors one by one. They seemed to operate at a very slow speed, and from the length of the queue, Abel thought it might be another hour before they could get in. But the carriage did not stop. Instead, they entered the city directly from the other side, passing by the people standing in the queue, looking jealously at him. Whether he was in the Bennett Castle or the Harry Castle, Abel had always felt that he was just a bit wealthier compared to the people around him. Yet this was the first time he had truly experienced the privilege of being a royal. Abel was still getting used to how things work in this new world. In his old world, if a person tried to jump in the queue, others would look at you with contempt. But in here, Abel did not even get called off the carriage and went straight into the city. The carriage arrived at a courtyard. It was Knight of Marshall's temporary residence in Harvest City. The moment they reached the gate, the housekeeper, Robin, immediately came out and greeted them. "Robin, Abel will be staying here for the next 2 days. Clean up that independent house and make a place for Abel to stay," said Knight Marshall to the housekeeper as he got off the carriage. "Yes, master." Housekeeper Robin knew that the Knight of Marshall had an adopted son and soon he would become the inheritor of the castle. However, it was only after hearing these commands by Knight of Marshall that Robin could fully understand the importance of the young master. Besides the master's private house, the best place to live was that independent house, yet Knight of Marshall had offered it Abel without hesitation. "Abel, do you want to come with me to visit my friends or go to play in Harvest City?" Seeing Abel's look of hesitation, the Knight of Marshall couldn't help but smile. "Of course, I will arrange Robin as your company to explore Harvest City." The Knight of Marshall did care about Abel. Not only did he understand Abel's choice by just looking at his expression, but he would also always respect his decision and never force him into doing anything he would be uncomfortable with. Abel rejected the company of housekeeper Robin. He just went off with his horse and began exploring the different shops in the street. Even though the streets of Harvest City were very wide because of the new year, there were people everywhere. Suddenly, Abel came across a noisy group of people arguing. The voice seemed very familiar, so Abel decided to lead the horse forward. It was Zach. He was arguing with 3 young men wearing leather armor. There was also a young girl with blonde hair, probably the age of 17 or 18, standing on the side watching the argument intensely. She seemed like a witty and playful type. When she laughed, there was a touch of cunningness in her eyes. "Big brother!" yelled Abel excitedly. It was such a surprise to see his family here. Abel jumped off his horse and ran towards Zack. "Abel," Zack replied as he gave Abel a tight hug. Afterwards, Zack turned toward the three men and introduced him to each other. "This is my brother Abel. And Abel, this is Martin, Joshua, and Bob." The young girl gave a slight bow to Abel and introduced herself with a chuckle. "Hello, my name is Emily," as she curiously scanned Abel. Abel returned to the bow and saw the big brother. Zack sneakily glanced at Emily's expression. It wasn't hard to figure out what was going on here. Zack was a young adult, after all. Abel laughed on the outside, but he wondered if he should write a letter to Mum about this. Martin had never have guessed that Abel would be so young. He was lost for words for a moment there. "Are you the one who forged the sword of 100 skills for Zack?" Abel smiled and nodded, "Yes." "Wow, really?" Martin immediately gave a passionate bow and said, "It was such a pleasure to meet you. I didn't expect you to be so young." Martin seemed to be a talkative and straightforward person. Must be a nice guy to hang around, Abel thought. A tall, thin man named Joshua grinned. "Martin, I think we've been fooled. There is no way this guy could have made that sword of 100 skills. The sword of 100 skills. Abel turned to look at Zack, who had been showing off his present ever since he's got it. Zack was kind of embarrassed. He started rubbing his palms together, made quick eye contact with Emily, and said, "The topic just came out of nowhere during my conversation with Emily. These three guys won't believe that my brother had forged a sword of 100 skills for me, so we started arguing." Abel's father always told him how grounded and mature his older brother is. But as he looked at his older brother, deeply trapped in the romantic spell of Emily, and losing all his dignity, Abel was speechless. "That sword was just my practice piece," Abel explained faintly. Things got kind of tense after Abel said that. The three other guys didn't know how to respond, but the looks on their faces were very worried. This was a sword of 100 skills. Who the hell would ever call it a practice piece? "Which forging masters did you learn it from?" Emily looked at Abel with her big, sparkling eyes. "Oh, I learned it from Master Bentham," Abel replied, meanwhile trying to be polite to the person who could very well be his future sister-in-law. Martin interrupted. "Master Bentham is very well known in the duchy. How long have you been following him?" 1 month. Martin, Bob, and Emily were in shock. "My God, that's incredible," they all said simultaneously. "Okay, even if his teacher is Master Bentham," Joshua said with a sneer, "do you believe that this kiddie can make a sword like this?" "Hey, don't be rude," Emily called Joshua out. Both Joshua and Zack were trying to please her, and she knew that much at least. That being said, it's not right to have a go at someone else's little brother. Also, she thought that Zack was an honest man, which meant that this accusation was all the more offensive in her eyes. Joshua glanced at Abel and snorted. He said in a threatening voice, "Abel, you shouldn't claim the work of your teacher." Zack was starting to get irritated as well. "Joshua, you better stop that nonsense talk right now. You wouldn't want to make me your enemy." Martin stood up and separated the two. "Hey, if you really want to know who made this piece, there's a giant hammer weapon store nearby. It's easy. We can just go there and have someone examine it for us." "Of course," said Zack as he turned to look his little brother, to which Abel responded with a cool nod. "That's a lot of faith coming from you, Zack." If you're so confident in your little brother, why don't we make a bet on it? Joshua laughed out loudly. After saying that, Joshua took out the big sword on his back. I don't know about that one right there, but the one I have here, this is a real piece made by Master Bentham. If your brother's sword is not the work of Master Bentham, I'll give my sword to you. If it is, though, you give that sword to me instead. Are you on, Zack? Martin intervened. Let's not escalate the situation. Guys, we're just going to have an authenticity test. We don't have to make any bets. Even Bob, who had remained silent during all this time, came forward and tried to calm down the tension. We're all friends, aren't we? If we're going to bet on something, how about the loser pays for the dinner tonight? Joshua said, You chickening out, Zack? Emily, unlike the others, was not aware of how serious the situation was getting. She was getting too thrilled by the upcoming match. I'll be the judge, she volunteered. Whoever the loser is, he has to give up on what he has betted on, okay? If not, I'll let him have a taste of my punishment. Looking at the overly excited Emily, Martin and Bob could not help but sigh. Women made men do stupid things, don't they? Abel was starting to frown a little. Ever since they met for the first time, Joshua had been contradicting everything that he said. If no one told him, Abel would have just guessed that Joshua was an enemy of Zack. Sure, I'll bet, Zack said angrily. He had enough of Joshua making fun of his little brother. In front of Emily, too. What a dirty way to gain an advantage over him. The Giant Hammer Weapon Shop was a shop specialized in selling weapons and armor. When customers come in, the first thing they would see would be the huge counter made entirely out of ironwood. Because of how big and heavy everything was in this world, only ironwood could suffice to hold the weight of the items for sale. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Giant Hammer Weapons Shop. I am the store manager, Ted. Is there anything you're after? Asked a thin, middle-aged man. Yes, Mr. Ted, we are here a heavy sword examined. Please, have your best appraiser come here and help us take a look at it, said Joshua in an unbearable hurry. Wait for a second, I'm the referee here, Emily protested with an I'm taking this very seriously look on her face. Give me the two swords, you two. I will be in charge of this. Without saying anything, Zack took out his sword and passed it over to Emily. Joshua was kind of reluctant at first, but after seeing Zack giving his sword to Emily, he was left with no choice but to hand it over as well. You are naggier than a woman, Emily said as she saw how hesitant Joshua was being. It was weird for a woman like her to say something like this. But anyway, she snatched the sword away from Joshua. Meanwhile, Ted just called out a long-bearded old man. This is the chief appraiser of the Giant Hammer Weapon Shop. All you need to do is to hand the swords over to him. For each piece that you are examining, we will charge you at a price of 2 gold coins. Emily took out 2 gold coins and put Zack's big sword on the counter. Okay, can you identify this weapon here, please? We want to see if it is the work of Master Bentham. The old appraiser got excited about that. He didn't expect to have the chance to examine a piece that could be made by a master forger. He took the big sword and inspected it carefully. Slowly but surely, the old appraiser's expression became more and more feverish. He started stroking the blade with his fingers, as though he was about to make fire with it. Whoever's made this masterpiece, it is a work of perfection, murmured the old appraiser. What witchcraft would you need to make this sword of 100 skills? Just look at how sharp the edges are. It's unbelievable. The old appraiser was completely lost in his own world. For a while there, he had probably forgotten that he was here to do his job. Emily coughed twice to get the old appraiser the attention again. Is this the work of Master Bentham, mister? Oh, no, of course not, the older appraiser said affirmatively. I don't know who's made it, but it is definitely not the work of Master Bentham. What? How is this possible? Joshua threw a blank stare towards the ceiling. He figured that something was wrong when he saw the expression on the old appraiser's face. But the way that the old man denied the piece being a work of Master Bentham. It was almost like the piece was too splendid to be made by someone even of that level. Joshua was getting more anxious by the seconds. Are you looking this properly, sir? He said to the old appraiser. You know, things won't go easy for you if you don't tell us the truth right now. The old appraiser threw a cold look at Joshua. If you are not satisfied with what I'm saying, go to the mayor and sue me. Remember this, though, the Giant Hammer weapon shop is the property of the city owner. If you want to cause any trouble for him, make sure you are ready for the consequences. Emily threw a disgusted glance towards Joshua, who was trying very hard to not lash out at the old appraiser. She picked up the two swords, gave them to Zack, and walked away like she had never known Joshua in the first place. Before Emily left, the old appraiser suddenly spoke. Is this a big sword for sale? He said in a sympathetic voice. I will offer 1,200 gold coins. It was a very confusing offer. Emily couldn't believe what she was hearing, so she asked, from what I've heard, a sword of 100 skills would cost about 1,000 gold coins. Why are you making the deal at 1,200 gold coins? The others were also very curious. Even Abel, too. Despite having lived 2 lives, this was the very first sword that he has made. Just how the heck was it so valuable? 1,000 gold coins are for ordinary swords of 100 skills. The value of the finest ones can be far greater than the ordinary ones. This piece right here, you can say that it is the finest of the finest. With a few strikes, I'm sure that it can easily destroy an ordinary sword of hundreds of skills. Equipping something like this is like having a double up of one's sword-wielding ability. Joshua had lost the bet, and after the group left Giant Hammer's weapons store, he walked off by himself. He was too embarrassed to stay with the group. Hey, Zack, why don't you shout us the dinner tonight? Martin and Bob said as they fixed their eyes on Zack's new sword. Emily, on the other hand, spent a great deal of her time throwing this curious look at Abel. Fortunately, though, she didn't ask him any specific questions. Whatever Abel's secret was, she was polite enough to not ask too much about it. Emily asked, Abel, can you forge a sword for me? I will pay you money. I only forge weapons for my family. Abel quickly refused. For goodness sake, if he said yes on the spot, Martin and Bob would have been his next customers. Hey, Emily cried out as she switched her eyes between Abel and Zack. You follow him, tell me where he is going. If he leaves the village, immediately report to me, Joshua said in a gloomy voice to his servant who was following by his side. The servant quietly agreed and began to follow Abel from a distance. I will make you regret what happened today. Joshua knew that Zack was a rank 4 novice knight. It wouldn't be easy to find a person to rob him. Plus, he was the heir of the Knight of Bennett. The consequences of harassing him could be very severe. Not his little brother, though. Abel was a blacksmith. It didn't matter how gifted you were, or if you were the follower of Master Bentham. At the end of the day, you were still a blacksmith, and no one would be bothered if you died. Little did Joshua know, he was only stepping further onto a road of no return. After Zack had won his bet, a few men were getting ready for a celebration at a luxurious restaurant. But Abel did not go with Zach. When they arrived at Harvest City, he departed from the group since he wanted to buy something. Abel counted the coins in his pockets. Other than the 20 gold coins he originally had, there was also the 50 gold coins that the Knight of Marshall gave him for entertainment at Harvest City. There were 70 gold coins in total, and he decided to spend it all on 138 little gems. However, to avoid attracting attention, he went to 4 separate jewelry stores to buy those gems. His wallet looked deflated, only 2 coins left. Still, Abel no longer had the nerve to use his Heredra cube out in the open streets. So, he found a hotel, booked a single room and used the Heredra cube to slowly combine the gems. It was like a walk in the park. In a short amount of time, Abel had combined the gems into 20 red gems and 26 blue gems. Abel was trying to remember the combination formula of the Heredra cube as he stared at the gems. He wondered which category of darkness 2 gems were the ones he had just combined. As he kept on staring, he suddenly had an idea. Why don't I combine 2 this time? He took out 3 blue gems and put them in the Heredra cube to combine again. By the time he took it out, it had become a large, round, transparent blue gem with countless cuts on the side. Let's try to level up again, thought Abel. He turned the remaining 6 blue gems into 2 more large round blue gems. Then put the 3 large round blue gems in the Heredra cube and pressed combined. This time it had turned into a droplet-shaped gem. Abel was certain that this was it. This was the perfect blue gem. The ultimate blue gem in Diablo 2 looked exactly like this. The Heredra cube had forcefully turned the blue gems into the ones in the video game settings. The droplet-shaped gem shined in a shade of blue that reflected a hint of melancholy. As Abel stared at it in his hand, he wasn't planning to sell such perfection. The Heredra cube possessed the great power to combine such perfect gems, which was big enough reason for Abel to be extra careful during the process of selling those normal blue gems. Luckily, Harvest City was a very developed region. Gems with such quality were not that hard to come by. 11,000 gold coins. While it was the amount that Abel sold his gems for, there was no way he was going to carry so much cash on him. So, he went to the shrine of the goddess of wealth and exchanged parts of it into 100-unit coins. He threw it all into the Heredra cube. Luckily it only showed a single digit, so it didn't take up any lattice. But when he decided to take it out, it turned into 100 gain. How convenient. 100-unit coins were most commonly used within large banks. They were a bit larger than normal gold coins and filled with the engraving of every goddess of protection. These goddess engraving needs to pass through the shrine to get made, so these 100-unit coins are very secure. With a cheerful look on his face, Abel began to plan on how he could spend all this money. Little did he know that someone had been stalking him this entire time. Funnily enough, it wasn't a good day for Joshua's servant, who spent his whole day following a young man who would just never stop walking. He had been to almost every jewelry shop in Harvest City riding his horse, and by that point, the servant was almost too tired to continue. He only wished that Abel would soon find a place for rest. Above his head was a signboard reading Edmund's Boutique Shop. This familiar signboard, Abel couldn't help but remember the chi condensing potion he had bought at Edmund's Boutique Shop. He already used up all the chi condensing potion he had. Soon he would be attacking the knight's level. If he slowly trained by himself, it would have taken him years of effort until he could have gained enough chi to condense his core. After using the Master's Chi condensing potion, he had leveled up by 2 levels. Abel had always worried if any problems were progressing through the levels with such speed, because immediately he had leveled up by 2, which was not what he had expected. As it turned out, drugs were not the only way to level up in short periods. There were other options. There was quite some evidence that this was true, as both Master Bentham and the Knight of Marshall were not shocked to see how fast he had attained another epiphany. If anything, they didn't seem surprised in any way, which could potentially mean that there was an alternative supplement for his training. According to Abel's knowledge, if there wasn't any problem leveling up with other methods, taking the no side effect Chi condensing potion definitely shouldn't be too harmful to him. That being said, now was probably a good time to get himself some supplies. The moment Abel stepped into Edmund's boutique shop, a familiar voice came out to greet him. "Welcome to Edmund's boutique shop. How can I help you today?" The voice stuttered as its owner did not expect Abel's visit. Welcome. Didn't expect to see you here, young and handsome gentleman. Ms. Yvette, what are you doing here?" Yvette gave out a small laugh and proudly said, "I got promoted from Fort Lee to the vice manager of Harvest City." "Congratulations, Ms. Yvette," Abel cheered. Yvette must have been very capable to become the vice manager of a large city sector such as Harvest City. Abel had great respect for outstanding people like her. From the look on her face, it was clear that Yvette liked being congratulated by someone she knew. Since there was a lot of stress after she got promoted to this position. Unlike a small city such as Fort Lee, even the position as a vice manager has 3 slots in here. "What would you like to buy today?" said Yvette softly. Abel pondered for a while and gave out a number. "I want 162 bottles of lesser Chi condensing potion." Yvette was excited by this large transaction of lesser Chi condensing potion. This deal would make her look really good in front of her boss. "It's 1620 coins in total. Let's settle the deal for 1600 coins, Yvette said after she applied the discount. Abel saluted to Yvette. "Please wait." Abel took out 16,100 coins from the Heredric cube and inserted it in his wallet. Then he pulled out his wallet and gave the coins to Yvette. After a short period, the shop assistant brought out a medium-sized box. Inside was tightly packed with 162 lesser Chi condensing potion. After Abel rode his horse back to his place, he immediately went to his room and combined 162 lesser Chi condensing potion into 6 Masters Chi condensing potion. Watching as those Chi condensing potion shone in its amber glow, Abel knew he was getting a massive power-up soon. As Abel was putting the 6 Masters Chi condensing potion in the Heredric cube, he remembered his transaction with Yvette today. Ms. Yvette never asked him for his name and the past 2 transactions had been quite smooth. Also with the name Edmund's boutique shop plus Yvette's cautiousness. Abel decided if he had anything inconvenient to sell in the future, he will leave it for Yvette to handle. Meanwhile, out on the courtyard, the weather was still freezing even though it was already a new year. That servant curled up in a dark corner, his eyes rigidly starred at the front gate. This place was the Knight of Marshall's temporary house and not many people knew about that. If the servant realized this was the resistance of a royal family, who knew if he would still have the nerve to continue spying? Ignorance, sometimes, was the only thing that was necessary for a disaster to happen. After dark, the gate of Harvest City had been shut, so the servant decided to continue spying. However, little did he know that the Knight of Marshall and Abel had already got on a carriage to join the New Year cocktail party in the city palace.